Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 19. My guest today is botanical and natural science illustrator Lee Angold. Lee lives in Waterloo, Canada, and has an interest in illustrating nature around her in a way that encourages others to take a second look and to see details and beauty in even simple everyday subjects. Lee has been someone who I've been inspired by, especially for her knowledge of colour. We chat in depth about this during our conversation today. Lee, thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to chat to you today.
Thanks. I'm excited to chat with you too.
I usually start by chatting with people about their early nature experiences. Did you have nature in your childhood?
I did. I grew up very urban in downtown Toronto, but one of my earliest experiences was actually with my mother. She is an anthropologist by training. And when I was very young, she worked at the Bones Lab at U of T, cleaning animal bones. And so she would bring me into work about once every week. And so I would go around and sketch all the little animal skeletons and peer in all the drawers. So I grew up with that exposure, playing with bones, as well as some farm programs and nature walks in the ravines and stuff. So
you've been a natural science illustrator from the very beginning.
Yes, it's been a long way around to get back to it, but I first heard about natural science illustration when I was 6 or 7 years old. I saw a documentary about a woman who was doing illustrations of she was working with entomologists, and they airlifted them down onto the canopy of the Amazon rainforest, like on a great big drop net.
Yes.
And so she was up there sketching and illustrating insects that had never been seen before. And I thought that was really cool. So that was my goal. When I was very young, I was running around telling people, I'm going to be a biology illustrator.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, I then, through my teens and 20s, I took a completely different path and ended up coming back to it. But yeah, lifelong.
Yeah, that's amazing. So how did you make that transition? How did you come back to it? So I was reading on your blog that you did an engineering degree and you got to the end and thought, maybe I don't want to be an engineer. And then what happened? Do you want to talk about that?
I think in high school, there's this big pressure to decide what you are going to do for the rest of your life. You need to choose your major that's going to determine what your job is, and like all of this hinges on one decision that you make when you're 17. And I think at the time I was, there were a lot of factors, but I think that at the root of it, I was just scared. Like I was scared of being disappointed, this like never meet your heroes thing. So I chose something that felt a little safer somehow. Like, I'm not as tied up to it. So I went through engineering school and I had a lot of trouble in university. I struggled with anxiety. And I also, through that, realized, really it took me a while, but realized that it really wasn't what I wanted to do. There are people who, you go through engineering and you meet people who are like really, really passionate about engineering. And that's not what I'm really, really passionate about. I'm passionate about other stuff. So I got through my degree always feeling like, well, it's terrible right now, but it'll be better when I'm done.
Later, yeah.
And of course, yes, it would have been. It was. But it was better, but it still wasn't what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And, as it turns out, you don't actually need to decide what you're doing when you're 17. You can change your mind. You can do many things. So I was fortunate enough that I was able to explore other options and sort of make my way back to my dreams.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about that? So you started studying botanical illustration?
Mm-hmm. So I haven't actually done a full degree in botanical art or even a full diploma, but I started out when I was curious about getting back into natural science illustration. I started out by starting with it's a diploma program offered through the Society of Botanical Artists, and I actually ended up suspending that partway through, but it gave me an introduction into some of the different natural science illustration fields, and it was a nice start.
So essentially you're a self-taught...
I'm essentially self-taught.
Scientific illustrator and botanical artist, and you're doing amazing, beautiful work. And I would love to talk with you because you were one of the first artists that I found when I started being interested in doing this myself, in making a career out of nature journaling and nature art. And so I found you on Instagram, and I was completely drawn to your work really quickly because you do really accurate pictures of things in nature, but you do it with a real punch. Like your work is really poppy. It's really powerful. And I think that this is because you have a real strong attraction to color, and you use color in a beautiful way. And so I'd love to talk with you about color. What is it about color that draws you to it? Because some illustrators do black and white, or I don't know, something about your work is just so full of punch and color. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I will say that I do actually also enjoy working in black and white, and I think that can be very powerful as well. But what I think interests me about natural subjects is how they're all fairly unique, and so they might... you might have a pattern, like a pine cone has a spiral pattern, but it's never perfect. It's never stiff. And so I try to create that natural look, whether it's with my use of paint or my use of line, to not have it be, this perfect rendition. It's nature. It should look natural. Some natural science artists will put a lot of effort into making perfect color transitions, and very, very subtle color. And I would rather err a little bit on the side of leaving some paint marks and allowing some colors to be a little brighter rather than the other way around. I try to make my artwork seem alive, seem bright, and that's how I see the world. And I'm always fascinated by all these bright little pops of color that you see everywhere, and so that's what I want to share with people as well.
That's really interesting, in fact, because I absolutely love botanical illustration, and yet the perfection of some of it puts me off in that it just seems like too seamless, like too perfect and too much like a photograph, and therefore not as interesting as something that's more alive. And I was looking at your work thinking, and I was trying to think about it in my mind, like what makes this alive? So it's really interesting that you have articulated exactly what that is, that it's not seamless, it's not blending perfectly, and that's what makes it raw or real.
Yeah, and I think that those perfect little cross hatches and perfect little blends, like it's an admirable skill, but it's not something that I am interested personally in focusing my development on.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's absolutely magical, and yet I'm drawn to other things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you have lots of information on your website, on your YouTube channel, on your Instagram page about color theory and color charts. And how did you develop your color knowledge? Was it pure experimentation?
So again, because I'm self-taught, and especially coming from a completely different academic background. So coming from engineering where everything is, derivations from here's the math that explains how this works. Going to art where a lot of art theory is presented in a very, very different way. And a lot of it didn't really make sense to me. Mm-hmm. And the way my brain works in terms of, artists will talk about, or, art instruction will talk about color theory in terms of color harmony. Like you need to choose this because it harmonizes together. You need to use less colors because they harmonize together. What does that mean? So, I'm sure there's a logic there, and what is that logic? And so a lot of what I've done is trying to understand things myself and doing the research that I need to understand things in a way that makes sense to me. And I think that I've always considered myself sort of a technical communicator, whether it's, that's how I survived engineering school, and it's how it's what my passion is in natural science illustration. So I think the other side of that then is sharing that sort of in a text way with whether it's the YouTube channel or my blog, is sharing those things that I've learned and presenting art in a different way for people who maybe don't connect with the more common way of teaching.
And that's wonderful, because you have developed something. You've developed a relationship with color, a relationship with art that's all about your process, your style, your way of doing it, and understanding it as well. It's no good just learning something. Oh, this makes a color harmony with this. You know it from the inside out because you learnt it by practicing it. Mm-hmm. You have this amazing thing that you do on your blog, which is you introduce us to your palettes, and you have lots of different palettes, and each one has a name and a purpose. Can you talk about your palettes and the purpose of having lots of different ones for different practices?
Sure. I mean, I think that just developed organically a little bit. When I first started botanical art, I had very little watercolor experience, but I had some sense that I would like to be working in watercolor. Mm-hmm. So I had done one of the textbooks recommended for the SBA course was, I think it's called the Botanical Palette.
Okay.
But it's a collection of different paintings by different artists, and it talks about what their materials were, what they used, and what their process was for making these paintings. And, it's ridiculous looking back, but I wanted to get the ideal palette. Yes. And yes. Everyone uses different colors, and I didn't really know where to start. So what I did was I went through this book and looked at all of these different paintings by different artists and literally just tallied up what paints are they using. And okay, well, these are the most common paints that artists are using. Oh, look, it matches up pretty closely to this Winsor & Newton palette. So I bought that palette thinking that must be the best because this is what the plurality of artists are using. Yeah. It didn't really totally occur to me that causality might go the other way, where this is a common beginner palette, so therefore everyone has it. Therefore, that's what they're using.
Yeah.
And so I got this palette, and I had some, having read some materials, including in that very book, about you want colors that are very transparent. And then I'm testing these colors and they're not very transparent. Well, why is that? And so at that point, I started reading up more on pigments and sort of took a deep dive and started exploring that and started collecting more and more paints. Now, it's great to try a bunch of paints, but it's not very practical to be working with 200 paints.
Yes. It's easy to get addicted to new paints, isn't it? You go in and there's this array and you think, oh, I'll try that one and that one. And then I've got this ginormous box of random paints.
Yeah. So sooner or later, you sort of have to start limiting it. And so gradually I started putting together, initially I was putting together these little boxes, like the little tins, and so I would choose some paints for one tin, and then I'd read up or I'd try something else and I'd make another tin. That has gotten a little unwieldy, so I have a few now that I sort of use interchangeably and can take them out to sketch or whatever. And then I also have a studio palette that has, at this point, I've been painting for long enough that I do have a fairly clear idea of what I tend to use most. And so I have a more stable ceramic studio palette at home.
It was on your inspiration that I started diving into real color theory, because when I have been doing art and nature art for a really long time, and yet it's only been in the last few years that I started learning about color, and it helps so much. So when I was first doing nature journaling, I was trying to match color with certain nature objects and I just couldn't get the match, and it was so frustrating. And so I saw you had done a giant color chart with all the paints you had, and I did one the same, a copy of what you had done, and it took me 2 weeks or something ridiculous to fill this chart. And yet when you do that, when you do all the swatches and you dive down and you're mixing all your colors, you learn so much, don't you?
You do, and you start noticing that you can, in fact, mix a lot of the same sorts of shades, used various different ways.
Exactly. So when you think you need 500 colors, you actually don't. And when you've charted them all out, you can understand that more.
Yeah.
It's a good feeling to have. Like, there's certain colors in my palette that I don't want to live without. Like, I don't want to live without phthalo blue. I don't want to live without ultramarine. Mm-hmm. What are the colors you can't live without?
Nickel azo yellow.
Ooh, good. Can you talk about this color?
Yes. So my initial frustration with my first little Winsor Newton palette, the thing that really stood out was the yellows, where I think I'd read a lot about, for botanical art, you want transparent colors. Now, I mean, at this point, I feel like that really depends what you're doing a little bit, and lots of people do great stuff with much more opaque colors. But at the time, I wanted transparent, I wanted non-granulating. And I think just personally, I'm more tolerant of a little bit of opacity in some colors than others. Mm-hmm. Where it, if a red is a little bit opaque, it doesn't bother me quite as much. But something about yellow, I wanted it to be liquid sunshine. I don't want any trace of milkiness in that yellow. And unfortunately, the majority of yellow pigments are actually fairly opaque. It's what makes them look yellow in the pan, is that opacity.
Yes, okay. And so nickel azo yellow is an amazing color because it has such a transition, doesn't it? It can be really golden and it can be really transparent.
Yeah, it is the most transparent watercolor pigment in any color index.
Mm.
And it's one of very few yellow pigments that could be considered transparent. So it's yeah.
How did you come to this color? Was it just lots of experimentation?
Yeah, pretty much. I experimented with a whole bunch of yellows, and it was just collected a bunch of yellow paints, and finally tried Nicolazo yellow and was like, oh, this is the yellow.
This is my yellow.
This is what I wanted in a yellow. So the thing is, it's like I don't really paint a lot of yellow subjects. I don't. It's not that I would generally consider yellow my favorite color by any means, but yeah, it's definitely my favorite watercolor paint. Mm-hmm. I could switch out my reds or my pinks. I could switch out my blues. Not the yellow.
That's your favorite. That's so cool. I'm interested to talk a little about like indie paint makers or handmade paints, because we tend to just get Daniel Smith or Winsor & Newton, whatever is the brand, but there's a whole lot of amazing handmade paint makers coming out. Do you spend a lot of time with handmade paints?
I've tried handmade paints by several paint makers, and some of them are very lovely. Sometimes you can get some unique pigments that aren't widely available in commercial brands. It's also it's an interesting process. Watercolor paint follows a fairly steady recipe. You've got pigment, you've got a little bit of gum arabic, maybe you've got some honey or something in it. But within that, there can be quite a bit of difference in how they behave, largely based on honey content. And so, yeah, I've tried a few handmade paints. They do tend to be a little bit more expensive, just because of the labor involved. But at the same time, it's really nice to support someone who's handcrafting this, and it feels kind of special, even if
it's a treat, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like I think of it like a little handmade chocolate or something. You know,
they do look like little candies, don't they?
So in 2018, you did a hugely ambitious personal project, which was the Daily Leaf. Can we talk about the Daily Leaf project you did?
Yeah, absolutely. So I every day in 2018, I went outside, I collected a leaf, I mapped where I found it, and I made art of that leaf. So I varied what my medium was. There was quite a bit of experimentation within that. Not all of it was very realistic, but every day I painted a leaf. It could be really tiny. Some things took 30 seconds and some things took 10 hours. But yeah, so that was a project.
A challenging one. I can't imagine doing a 365-day project.
Yeah, the challenges were, I guess, a little bit different than I expected them to be. I thought since they didn't... I'd done some daily art projects in the past, but like only a month long. And I thought, well, I'll still be able to do lots of other stuff, because if I'm working on something else, I can just do a very short little leaf. The challenge I found was with context switching, where there's really only so much you can focus on in a day. And so I found it difficult to work on a longer project, a bigger painting, while also doing a leaf every day, because I would have to interrupt it. And even if I did something really simple, it was just now I'm thinking about something else, and now I'm done that. And if I did it at the beginning of the day, then after I was done, I couldn't get into the other thing. And if I pushed it off to the end of the day, it was hanging over my head the whole time.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of a challenge. Otherwise, it was all right.
But you managed it, and then at the end of the year you had or maybe in early 2019, you had an exhibition for all the leaves, which must have felt so good to have them all together.
I did exhibit them all together at a local community space. It was very interesting hanging them all up because they'd been collecting in a stack, and the stack got quite big, but it's still paper. And once they're taking up several rooms all around, it's just like you're sort of faced with your own insanity. Like, what was I doing?
Is that something you'd do again, or was it just too much?
Absolutely not. I would strongly recommend that anyone else do like a month-long project. I think that getting in the habit of making art every day is good and valuable. But I am done with daily projects.
Yeah, pressure in art. I don't know. I feel it if I have a commission or something. I don't do a lot of commissions, but if I do, then I just feel a lot of pressure, and it's not a fun feeling, is it?
No.
So, you have been to Australia. You came here for the Guild of Natural Science Illustrators conference?
Yes, I did.
Tell me about your trip. Tell me about what you saw. You did some nature journaling. You went up North Queensland. I'd love to hear about it.
Yeah. So the GNSI conference was in Brisbane, and so we have some family friends in Melbourne. So we flew into Melbourne, visited with family friends for a few days, and then we sort of went up the coast. So we went to Brisbane for the conference, and then up into North Queensland, went into the rainforest. That was lots of fun. I got quite a bit of sketching in during the conference and during our rainforest trip, and then headed back down to Melbourne and then back home. So we were there for about 3.5 weeks total.
I was smiling at one of your pictures on Instagram because you said this is a conference where doodling and drawing during the conference is encouraged.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great group. It's really fantastic. It's a great group of people. So I'd gone the previous year to the conference in Washington, D.C., and I do look forward to going to more of them once they start up again. But yeah, that probably won't be next year because...
Yes. I'm interested to talk about the difference between nature journaling, which is much more investigative and free and relaxed, versus the scientific illustration you do, which is really exact and detailed. Tell me about your nature journaling practice, because you do nature journaling for yourself and you're also taught nature journaling.
Yes. So I do want to specify that although I'm a botanical artist, I've done some scientific illustration, the majority of the commissions that I've done have been for commercial purposes. So that is a different realm than scientific botanical illustration. And so, although I do strive to be realistic and scientifically accurate in generally with commercial clients, that's not really their goal, and it's not quite so important. So, there are some inaccuracies that I'm aware of in some of my work. In terms of nature journaling, I feel like it's sort of, they're related. Where scientific illustration is about communicating something to someone else, and nature journaling is a process for yourself. Now, I'm very process-driven in general with my art, where I once I've done something, I don't want to look at it again. I do illustrations for the process of doing them, for what I learned while I'm doing them. And so nature journaling is more of that, and in a less formal way, where I don't have to have something polished to present to someone else. It's freeing. It can be any subject that interests me. It's in a book that I don't have to share with anyone. I can abandon a sketch halfway through and do something else and write notes in the margins and play with colors. So I think that they're both valuable, but it's also very important to just not feel this pressure to every piece of art needs to be perfect and precious. And, the process is just as important, and that's actually how you're going to develop as an artist anyway.
Yeah, I really like that, the distinction between making something for someone else and making something for you, and that nature journaling is really a process for you, isn't it? And having something that you don't intend to share or don't need to share, you can if you want, but it's not the goal, is really important for self-development as well.
Yeah, and it's also, it's getting back to what I would think most of us are, drew us to art in the beginning, is a curiosity and an enjoyment of the process, and being able to just do that without the pressures of all the, adult, I need to finish this on this deadline stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when you step outside where you are in Waterloo, Canada, what do you see? What's nature look like around you?
Well, right now it's December, so this is the beginning of our winter. So it's about -6 degrees out right now. So we've still got a little bit of green popping up through the ice that hasn't totally died yet. I've got so my garden, the kale still survived. It'll die eventually. But most of the foliage, like the trees, have all dropped their leaves. We get snowfall every few days, so then we get nice the postcard thing with all the nice snow on the branches, but that tends to melt off. We get, on these shoulder seasons especially, we'll get a warmer day that's just above freezing, and then it'll drop back down again. So we get lots of bare trees and a lot of dried foliage right now.
That's just blowing my mind, because today is okay, but we've just come out of a week-long heat wave here, and we had just over 40 degrees the other day, and I can't even imagine. I've seen snow before, but only a couple of times, and certainly not like that, and I can't imagine living in a place where it's negative degrees.
I mean, Canada's a very large country, much like Australia, so there's a big range of what the climates look like. I'm in southern Ontario, which is probably, it's like, we by Canadian standards, our winters are pretty wimpy. But we do definitely have a real winter by the standards of anywhere else in the world. And we also have very, very hot summers. So we've got sort of the extremes. There was some study done at some point about what the most common topics of conversation are in different countries. And Canadians love talking about the weather because it's new every day. It's all over the place. So
yeah. That must be amazing, though, to see that, especially, and to document that in your nature journal, that you have a real summer, you have a real change in the patterns of weather over the year. That must be a beautiful thing, and to be able to see, this is the beginning of spring, this is the beginning of when that flower blooms, or whatever.
Yeah, so, we've definitely got a very, because we have these extreme weather patterns, there are very, very specific seasons for things where, there's a few weeks where you can pinpoint, like, in these 2 weeks this is going to bloom, and in those 2 weeks that's going to fruit. Yeah,
That's really cool. I'd love to chat a little bit about you had a bit of a realization when you came back from Australia about globalization and about climate change and about how we all need to start to settle into our home places and travel less.
Yeah.
I'd love to chat about that realization you had.
I've always enjoyed travel. And, it's this curiosity thing. I always want to see new places and see new things. And I do really enjoy that. But it's interesting because when you go somewhere new, there's an acting like a tourist thing where you visit all the tourist attractions, or if you're into nature journaling, you're out in the woods and looking at all, like, oh, look at this weird bird. And weirdly, you come back home and maybe you're not someone who has looked at birds very much at all at home. So you go to another continent and you're with a tour guide who's pointing out all the birds, and suddenly you're so fascinated by, here's a kookaburra, but there's plenty of birds you don't recognize at home.
Yeah.
In your tiny little urban backyard, and you're like, what's that? Oh, it's a pileated woodpecker. Never seen that before. In your own backyard.
Yeah.
And so part of it is just, that I think this is something that nature journaling brings, is this curiosity about everything around you. And the more you look, the more questions you have. And once you get into that mindset, then you see something different, and you're primed for that. So part of it is just a realization of, oh, there's so much to explore right where I am. And, in a related way, when I was painting a leaf every day, there's all sorts of leaves that I saw, again, with the seasons thing, where it's like, there's only so many days of fall. So I didn't get the chance to really look into that one really closely. Or there's only so many days of spring. And horse chestnuts have their little budding leaves they look alien. So part of it is just this opening yourself up and experiencing that creativity. But then the other side was just a realization about, my reasoning for going to this conference, which, it's a wonderful experience from the conference side, but from the travel side, I was definitely drawn to, I wanted to go snorkeling. Specifically, I wanted to go snorkeling on the Great Barrier Reef, which I didn't end up doing. But part of the draw was, well, here's this endangered thing.
Yeah.
It's magical. It's a great wonder of the world, and it's going to be gone. And I need to go do that before it's gone, which is like a really, really depressing, horrible, let me fly around the world, destroying the planet to go. Yeah. I think that the part of it was just going there and experiencing all these new things, and then realizing, and people in Australia are like, wow, you have snow.
Yeah, exactly.
You have ice. You have a whole season where the plants are dead.
Yeah. I loved your reflection on return that there's wonder everywhere. There's wonder in your backyard, and it's really important to connect with that. The things that are around you are fascinating, and you might not have looked at them before, just like you said, because you think they're always there. And a lot of people who come to Australia have seen a lot more of Australia than I have, because I haven't gone there. I haven't been to the Great Barrier Reef before, and there's so much to see close to home, and it's really important for people to understand that, isn't it?
It is. It is.
When you're teaching nature journaling, what do you want to impart to your students? What do you want them to take away?
So I'm like a puppy or a 6-year-old. I walk around in the woods and I pick up little sticks and bits of lichen and stuff. And I think that that's so fascinating. And so in my art and also through nature journaling, I just want to share that wonder of the world of those things that we walk past every day.
Yeah.
And like, this is actually really interesting and beautiful. And, I want to know more about it. Do you want to know more about it? And so, but to me, a lot of the focus of nature journaling for myself and what I want to share with others is that wonder, that, going out into the world and that curiosity about what's there, and helping people connect with that. And yeah.
I love what you said before, how it builds on itself. Once you start it, once you get into that mindset, it just grows and grows and grows. And then you're looking over there and there's something else fascinating. And then you're looking over there and there's something else. It really does grow itself, doesn't it?
It does.
Lee, how can people find you online? What's the best way to connect with you and your work?
Okay, so my website is leeangold.com, and you can contact me through there. I'm also on YouTube. My channel is Lee Angold, or on Instagram is the other place that I'm frequently active. And again, just Lee Angold.
Thank you so much for chatting with me. It's been so good to dive into especially colour and also your insights in nature journaling. Thank you so much, Lee.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Lee. I really loved having the chance to chat with her in detail about colour and watercolour choices, and I was moved by her insights about how we can travel across the globe looking for natural wonders, but in the end, we have natural wonders in our own backyard that we might not have explored before. You'll find links to Lee's work in the show notes for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.